He had constructed his empire from the ground up, yet nothing could have equipped him for the instant a small child arrived at his doorway, asserting that he was his son. The boy's likeness to him was indisputable. However, how could that be feasible? The mysteries of the past were poised to be revealed, along with a life James was unaware of. James Williams dedicated his entire life to constructing his empire, concentrating on his career and enterprise. Success was paramount to him. It was his motivation, his fervor, and the rationale behind his relentless work ethic, persisting day and night without respite. He amassed his fortune from scratch, forsaking relationships and a personal life to which he had never devoted sufficient time. Family appeared to be an abstract notion, reserved for others who possessed the leisure to engage with it. His existence centered on commerce, acquisitions, and strategic planning, and he found satisfaction in it. He possessed all requisite resources: wealth, authority, and influence. However, everything transformed abruptly. On a brisk evening, when James returned home following an arduous day at the office, he followed his customary path along a tranquil street adjacent to his residence. The hour was late, and the road was almost deserted, yet something drew his attention: a flash of orange in the distance. Initially, he suspected a malfunctioning streetlight. However, upon approaching, he saw it was fire. The flame's radiance filled the nocturnal sky, creating a surge of panic within him. Impulsively, he depressed the brake and veered to the roadside. His heart raced as he seized his phone and called 911, yet something compelled him to pause. He was excessively proximate now. He could already perceive the house, consumed by fire, its windows obscured by smoke. The atmosphere was thick with anxiety, and he discerned a sound that elicited a shiver down his spine: the faint, desperate cries of a kid. Without hesitation, he sprinted towards the house. The flames were dense, and the smoke was suffocating, yet James remained indifferent. He was not contemplating his safety or the perils of a fire. He heard the cries once more, now more pronounced, and realized he could not await the firemen. He needed to take action promptly. Upon entering the house, he was immediately confronted by the oppressive heat. Yet, his sole objective remained the search for the youngster. The smoke irritated his eyes, yet he persevered, desperately seeking the origin of the cries. The home appeared interminable. With each corner he navigated, unveiling further destruction. Ultimately, in the most distant chamber, he observed the infant. A young boy, no older than 4 or 5, was cowering in the corner, his eyes filled with terror. James acted without hesitation. He lifted the boy into his arms, disregarding the intense heat, and sprinted back toward the front entrance. The smoke impeded his respiration, yet he persevered, the echoes of the child's wails resonating in his ears. He was nearly safe when he observed the firefighters arrive. He entrusted the youngster to one of them, panting for breath, his pulse still racing from the adrenaline. However, it was not yet concluded. As James turned to depart, he observed a woman sprinting towards the house. Her visage was marked by terror, and her gaze fixed upon him with an expression of despair. She approached him rapidly and halted abruptly upon seeing the boy in the firefighter's embrace. She became immobilized, gazing intently, and for an instant, neither party uttered a word. Subsequently, the woman took a trembling step nearer, her eyes widened as she murmured, "That is my son." James gazed at her, perplexed, as the flames and turmoil continued to envelop them. However, when gazing at him, a realization occurred. It was as though a lightning bolt had struck him. He identified her. She was Lisa, his former girlfriend, the singular individual he had cherished and subsequently lost many years prior. He had not encountered her in years, since their separation, yet, standing before him, she appeared as familiar as ever. He began to speak, however his thoughts were tumultuous. How is this possible? He was unaware that they had a child together. They had been meticulous in their amicable separation and concentrated on their individual lives, resulting in neither discussing the future or potential subsequent developments. Lisa also appeared astonished. She gazed at the youngster in the firefighter's embrace, her complexion ashen, her lips quivering as she murmured, "You are unaware, are you not? This is your son." James was unable to articulate. His world was in turmoil. He had never been aware. How could he be unaware? Questions inundated his thoughts. Yet before he could articulate anything, Lisa advanced, her gaze fixed on the youngster. "I never disclosed this to you," she stated, her voice scarcely perceptible amidst the cacophony of fire trucks and sirens. "I contemplated. I believed you were disinterested in knowing. However, he belongs to you, James. He is your son." The words struck him with force. His offspring. He has a son about whom he was unaware. The situation appeared implausible. But, amidst the smoke-laden atmosphere, it felt more tangible than any prior encounter. He was uncertain about what to articulate or how to respond. His thoughts were disordered, attempting to comprehend multiple concepts simultaneously. The conflagration persisted behind them, yet James remained still. He remained motionless, gazing at Lisa, attempting to comprehend. How can this be authentic? How had he overlooked this? Furthermore, what actions did he do now? In what manner did he rectify the situation? Amidst the turmoil, he could only remain stationary, bearing the burden of an unforeseen truth. James remained in his car, the engine idling, his thoughts tumultuous from the altercation outside the residence. The fire had long been contained, yet the gravity of Lisa's words and his recent revelation rendered him immobile in his seat. His offspring. He fathered a son. The revelation weighed heavily in his chest, hindering his ability to breathe. He cast another glance at the house, still emitting smoke, as the fire engines commenced their departure, and his thoughts were only occupied by the youngster, the boy who had lived without him for the past 4 years. How could he have been unaware? He had been unequivocally confident in his life and decisions, firmly believing that his work and empire were of paramount importance. However, at this moment everything seems trivial. He had overlooked it, overlooked some aspect of his existence that he was entirely unaware of. An infant, his offspring. At this moment he was uncertain about his next course of action. His thoughts surged as he reflected on his recent discussions with Lisa, questioning how she could have concealed this from him. Why had she not informed him? Was she attempting to shield him from responsibility, or had she completely relinquished her efforts toward him? The sound of the automobile door opening roused him from his reverie. He glanced upward to observe Lisa advancing towards him, her complexion still ashen from the trauma of the fire and their confrontation. She ambled cautiously, as though uncertain about how to engage with him. He experienced an overwhelming sense of frustration, intertwined with perplexity. He sought solutions. He required comprehension of the reasons behind the concealment of this information from him. Upon reaching the car, she paused momentarily, gazing at him with the same brown eyes that had previously instilled in him a sense of peace and security. However, those eyes suddenly instilled in him a sense of uncertainty, as if they concealed secrets to which he had never been privy. Ultimately, she articulated, her tone gentle yet firm. "James," she said softly, "I recognize that this is substantial information to absorb. I did not intend for you to discover this in this manner. However, you must comprehend that I was uncertain about how to convey this to you." He gazed at her, endeavoring to restrain his feelings, however it was challenging. "How could you not inform me?" he inquired, his tone abrasive before he could restrain it. "How could you conceal something of this nature from me? I have been living my life entirely unaware that I have a son. And you," he paused, unwilling to proceed. The words were lodged in his throat. "Why did you remain silent?" Lisa averted her sight, inhaling deeply before re-establishing eye contact with him. She appeared to compose herself, as though attempting to articulate the appropriate words. She expressed her uncertainty, her voice now subdued and somewhat contrite. "Following our separation, I had fear. I contemplated. I presumed you would prefer to avoid any association with him, that you would be indifferent. Your dedication to your work was so intense that I refrained from imposing it upon you. I never intended to impose that level of strain on you. James ran his hand through his hair, attempting to comprehend her words. He was so engrossed in his work and captivated by the ambition that propelled him to success that he never paused to contemplate the repercussions of that concentration. He constructed an empire, and in doing so he disregarded all else. Now, he confronted an unfamiliar child and a woman who had concealed the truth from him. However, you ought to have informed me, he stated, his tone softening, although the frustration persisted. I was entitled to be informed. I was entitled to participate in his life and support him. Lisa acquiesced, her eyes brimming with remorse. She acknowledged softly, I am aware. I apologize. I ought to have spoken up, but I was fearful, James. I had no intention of jeopardizing your life or compelling you into an unwanted situation. A prolonged pause ensued between them. James sat in the car, gazing out the glass, his head swirling with incomprehensible thoughts. He had consistently asserted that his success sprang from diligence and sacrifice, yet he was beginning to doubt everything. What was the value of it all if he had overlooked something as significant as this? His offspring, Maximum. He was incredulous. He was unable to fathom how he had navigated his existence without awareness of him, how he had never entertained the notion that there existed another someone who shared his blood, his genes, his name. I am uncertain of my next course of action, James remarked, his voice scarcely audible, as the gravity of the situation enveloped him like a burdensome shroud. I lack the knowledge to fulfill the role of a father. I have never contemplated it. Lisa approached him, her demeanor becoming more empathetic. It is unnecessary to possess all knowledge at this moment. No one among us does. We proceed incrementally. James glanced at her, his eyes brimming with doubt. However, it is not solely about me, is it? The subject pertains to Max. He merits a paternal figure. He merits an opportunity. Lisa acquiesced, her eyes shimmering with uncried tears. He merits more than I can provide independently. I never anticipated your return to the situation. I never anticipated that you would desire this. James confessed uncertainty about his desire, the words seeming peculiar as they left his lips. However, I am aware that I cannot simply depart. I must attempt. I am uncertain of the method, although I am eager to discover it. Lisa's expression softened, a faint, melancholic grin appearing at the corner of her lips. That is all I request, James. Simply attempt. James breathed deliberately, the gravity of the moment becoming apparent. Retracement was not an option. His existence, their existences, had just transformed. Regardless of his preparedness, he now had a responsibility. He had a son, and whatever of the circumstances, that was an undeniable reality. After a final glance at Lisa, James opened the car door and exited, prepared to confront whatever was ahead. He lacked all the solutions, yet he saw that he could no longer evade the situation. This represented his opportunity to become a father, a prospect he had never deemed feasible. James remained in a daze for the subsequent days, unable to dispel the profound epiphany that had transformed everything. The fire, the boy, and the moment Lisa revealed that Max was his son all felt like a dream, an elusive reality he struggled to comprehend. His customary regimen of meetings, emails, and conference calls now seems futile. He was unable to cease contemplating Max, the young boy whose existence he had recently discovered, and the multitude of experiences he had missed in the child's life. James was agitated, gazing at his phone yet incapable of initiating any calls, uncertain about how to commence this new chapter. How does one seamlessly assume the role of a parent after an extended period of absence? He often revisited the sight from the fire in his thoughts. Max's fearful gaze, characterized by wide eyes, and the sensation of his diminutive form in his embrace. James had never envisioned himself as a father, much less to a child of whose existence he was unaware. However, as he sat in his office, gazing vacantly at his desk, he recognized that there was no possibility of retreat. This was authentic. Max was his son, and he needed to choose how to fulfill the paternal role the boy required. He resolved to visit Lisa's residence once more. He sought answers. Nevertheless, more importantly, he desired to see Max once again. The youngster had integrated into James's life in an inexplicable manner, and he saw that evasion would not eliminate the reality of the situation. He could no longer conceal himself behind his profession and his labor. He was required to attend and be present. He considered that the initial step, attendance. Upon his arrival, Lisa was already awaiting him at the entrance. Her expression conveyed cautious optimism, although it also revealed a trace of uncertainty. She had evidently had significant challenges while raising Max independently, and James recognized that he could not anticipate her to readily reintegrate him into their lives without reservation. He needed to demonstrate his preparedness and seriousness. "Hello," Lisa spoke gently, her tone uncertain. "I did not anticipate your visit today." James offered her a faint smile. However, it failed to illuminate his eyes. "I was compelled to. I cannot continue evading this, Lisa. I cannot feign indifference." She acquiesced, moving aside to permit his in. "I am pleased you arrived. Maximum. He has inquired about you. He is still attempting to comprehend everything, yet he has been posing numerous inquiries." James entered the home after her, his mind inundated with myriad notions. He felt apprehensive. He was unfamiliar with fatherhood and lacked the ability to bond with a child he had never encountered. He possessed neither a guidebook nor a blueprint for this endeavor. He had dedicated years to cultivating a profession and mastering business expertise. Nonetheless, this was an altogether novel endeavor. Upon entering the living room, they observed Max seated on the floor, his back turned towards them, engaged with a toy. Initially, he failed to observe James's entrance. James paused momentarily, observing the boy. The similarity was unmistakable. Max possesses wavy hair and identical dark brown eyes. His resemblance to James was so striking that it bordered on the strange. The atmosphere was laden, and James was uncertain about his subsequent course of action. He had never encountered a problem of this nature previously. He desired to engage the youngster, yet he was apprehensive about overwhelming him. Ultimately, Max pivoted and observed James positioned there. The child momentarily halted, his eyes expanding as he gazed at the unfamiliar individual before him. He hesitated momentarily before speaking in a subdued voice, as if uncertain of his words. "Are you my father?" he inquired. James's heart raced at the inquiry. It was the inaugural instance of anyone addressing him in that manner, and receiving it from his son was profoundly moving. He gulped, attempting to regain his composure. He responded affirmatively, his voice laden with emotion. "I was unaware of your existence until recently. However, I am present now, Max. I wish to become acquainted with you." Max remained silent first. He only gazed at James, his little visage inscrutable. James perceived the bewilderment in the boy's eyes, the apprehension, which rendered him feel like an interloper in his own son's existence. Max was quite justified in his confusion and uncertainty. James had not supported him, yet now he sought to be included in his life. Lisa, who had been silently positioned near the doorway, advanced. "Max, it is acceptable," she stated gently. "James is your father. He is trustworthy." Max gazed at her, then redirected his attention to James. After a little interval, he nodded slowly. However, he appeared to remain uncertain. He responded in a subdued manner. James had a surge of relief. Although modest, it represented an initial step. The boy had not dismissed him. There existed a glimmer of optimism, if minimal, that they may initiate the development of a relationship. For the subsequent hours, James remained with Max and Lisa, attempting to acclimate to the new reality. He was uncertain of fatherhood, although he saw the necessity to make an effort. They engaged in various games, discussed academic matters, and gradually, as the evening progressed, James began to get a sense of rapport with the youngster. It was not flawless, just the contrary, but it was authentic. Thus commenced a new chapter. Upon departing that evening, James experienced a blend of feelings. He lamented the irretrievable time and the moments forever lost. However, a sense of resolve was also emerging within him. He would not permit fear or uncertainty to hinder his support for Max. This individual was his progeny. Regardless of the challenges, he was determined to be the parent that Max warranted. While driving home, James was preoccupied with thoughts of the youngster and the potential future that awaited. Numerous challenges needed to be resolved. For the first time in years, he sensed a purpose that beyond his professional obligations. He now has a son. He was determined to ensure he would not forfeit any further experiences in his life. The subsequent week appeared to be a haze for James. His mind was perpetually in motion, attempting to comprehend all that had transpired and to devise a strategy for navigating this altered reality. Fatherhood was never a consideration in his plans. He had never contemplated this, and now, unexpectedly, he was expected to be involved in a child's life. Max, his kid, was still attempting to acclimate to this unfamiliar man who emerged unexpectedly, asserting that he was his father. Whenever James believed he was beginning to comprehend how to engage with the youngster, an event would occur that made him feel as though he was once again failing. James frequented Lisa's residence. However, each visit engendered a feeling of frustration. Max would interact with him briefly, posing inquiries about his life, but would subsequently withdraw, as if uncertain of how to behave. It was comprehensible. Max had been nurtured only by Lisa, and now, unexpectedly, a man had entered his life, a man designated as his father, yet not truly integrated into his existence. Lisa was also reluctant. She had acquired the ability to manage all responsibilities independently, rearing Max without assistance from his biological father. Her hesitation to really trust James was apparent, despite her acknowledgement of wanting him to be included in their life. How could she, after all these years, suddenly permit someone to re-enter their life, someone who had missed so much? One evening, following another uncomfortable yet silent visit, James sat alone in his car in the driveway, gazing at the front door. He observed the glimmer of light emanating from the windows. He attempted to converse with Max, although it consistently felt contrived. He observed that the youngster was uncertain about how to respond to this abrupt incursion into his life. It caused James to perceive himself as an outsider within his own family. Following an extended interval, James ultimately exited the vehicle. He approached the front door with deliberate slowness, sensing a knot constrict in his stomach. He tapped gently, anticipating a response. However, he was already aware it would be Lisa. She consistently responded first. The door opened, revealing her presence. Her expression was gentle yet cautious. "James," she articulated, her tone composed yet tinged with uncertainty. "Max resides in his chamber. He has inquired about you. He remains uncertain. However, I believe he is beginning to comprehend." James nodded, attempting to restrain the surge of emotions that overwhelmed him. He lacked paternal knowledge, however he was present and making an effort. He merely hoped it sufficed. Max was seated at his little desk, inscribing notes in a notepad. He remained unresponsive as James entered, resulting in an extended quiet between them. James positioned himself at the bed's edge, uncertain of how to articulate his thoughts. How could he resolve all issues in a single discussion? How could he rectify the years of absence and neglect? "Greetings, Max," James articulated, his tone gentle yet firm. "How are you?" Max glanced upward, briefly meeting his eyes before returning his attention to the notebook. He murmured, offering little information. James inhaled deeply. He recognized Max's efforts, although the barriers between them were insurmountable. "I have a present for you," he stated, retrieving a little gift bag from his jacket pocket. "I presumed you would appreciate it." Max paused briefly before gradually approaching James, his gaze scrutinizing the bag. He retrieved it from James's hands and opened it with caution. Inside was a diminutive miniature vehicle, which James recalled him mentioning a few weeks prior. James remarked, his voice subdued and tentative, that he recalled your fondness for cars. "I believed you would appreciate this." Max observed the item briefly before directing his gaze towards James. His demeanor remained cautious. However, a glimmer of curiosity was evident in his eyes. He expressed his gratitude softly. However, a note of hesitation permeated his tone. It was minimal, yet it constituted a contribution. To James, it appeared to be a minor breakthrough. "I am attempting," Max murmured, with the words escaping before he could restrain them. "I understand it is challenging. I recognize that I am unfamiliar to you. However, I wish to support you. I wish to become acquainted with you. I am not departing." Initially, Max remained silent. However, after an extended period, he gave a small nod. Although minimal, it represented progress to James. Gradually, over the ensuing days, circumstances began to change, however marginally. Max started to interact with him more, inquiring about his profession and personal life, as if he were attempting to understand the father he had never met. James was uncertain how to respond to several inquiries. Nevertheless, he exerted himself, anticipating that his effort would be valued. Lisa also began to soften. She remained cautious, however she started to trust James incrementally. One evening, while seated in the living room post-dinner, she gazed at him, her demeanor contemplative. She remarked, her voice softer than normal, that you are performing better than she anticipated. James gazed at her, uncertain of how to reply. He stated plainly that he is making an effort. "I lack the knowledge to accomplish this, yet I am present. I desire to be involved in his life. I aspire to execute this correctly." Lisa acquiesced, her gaze becoming gentle. "I comprehend that. Max is beginning to perceive it as well. It will not occur instantaneously, James. However, he is no longer dismissing you. That is an excellent beginning." James exhaled a breath he had not consciously acknowledged he was holding. It was not flawless, yet it was substantial. For the first time, he permitted himself to imagine that it could succeed, that they could progress, albeit gradually. Although he lacked all the solutions, he was beginning to sense that, perhaps, he could successfully navigate this situation. Intended for Max. To Lisa. For his own benefit. James awoke the following morning with a palpable sense of dread constricting his chest. The preceding weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions and ambiguity, and although he had advanced with Max, it seemed there was perpetually an unresolved tension between them. Each advancement appeared to be succeeded by two regressions. He had never comprehended the intricacies of relationships, particularly with a child he had not previously known. As time progressed, he exerted increasing effort to fulfill his role as a father to Max. But, despite his diligence, he was plagued by the persistent uncertainty that he was failing in his responsibilities. Following the recent incidents, James saw that he could no longer persist with his lackluster efforts. He needed to discover a method to genuinely engage with Max, ensuring he felt at ease with the concept of having a father, despite the fact that he was unfamiliar to him. James perceived himself as a failure whenever Max distanced himself or remained silent, as if he were uncertain about how to manage this altered dynamic. He was unaware of how to dismantle the barriers Max had constructed, barriers that were reasonably there after their prolonged separation. The ambiguity was overwhelming. Nevertheless, despite his uncertainty, James was unable to restrain his desire to attempt it. This transcended mere attendance. It involved being present in a manner hitherto unexperienced, embracing a position that was both daunting and foreign. It was not concerned with perfection. It pertained to the endeavor of rectifying matters. As the sun commenced its descent that evening, James drove to Lisa's residence once more. He had devoted the day to contemplating Max's gaze, noting how the boy's eyes somewhat softened when James communicated, demonstrating any form of sympathy or concern. Max appeared to be assessing James, determining his authenticity and commitment to remain present. The ambiguity in his gaze was distressing to observe. Upon his arrival, Lisa acknowledged him with a nod. Her face appeared fatigued, yet it radiated a warmth that he had not observed in her for an extended while. The hesitancy persisted, albeit less acutely. She permitted him entry into their life, yet maintained a protective barrier from both him and her feelings. James announced as he entered the living room. Max was seated on the couch, engrossed in a video game. The routine was unchanged, yet this evening, it felt distinct. It appeared to be a potential turning point. "Greetings, Max," James remarked, attempting to appear nonchalant, although aware that his voice revealed his underlying anxiety. Max averted his gaze from the TV, yet his countenance remained inscrutable. It was neither a smile nor a grimace. Max muttered before redirecting his attention to the game. James observed him for a brief period, uncertain of how to advance. Perceiving the stress, Lisa entered the room and offered a gentle smile. Why not provide him some space? He has been engaged in that game for several hours, and it is perhaps time to pause. James acquiesced. However, he could not conceal the exasperation on his visage. He recognized Lisa's attempt to console him, although the stillness between him and Max was overwhelmingly pronounced. He was unaccustomed to this. He was unaccustomed to being disregarded and to lacking direction for his subsequent actions. He sought to converse with Max, although each attempt suggested that Max was unprepared to listen. "Max," James proposed, inhaling deeply, "shall we step outside for a moment? I intend to instruct you on how to ride a bicycle. I acknowledge your practice, although I believed I could assist." Max paused, his thumb immobilized on the controller for an instant. A little silence ensued before he spoke once more. "I do not require assistance with that," he stated bluntly, still avoiding eye contact with James. James was uncertain whether to feel displeasure or comprehension. The youngster had endured several years in his absence and was unwilling to confide merely at James's insistence. He was aware of that. He needed to address this with tolerance, regardless of the frustration it caused. James acknowledged this softly. "However, I am present, Max. I am not departing. I would genuinely appreciate the opportunity to spend time with you. Only the two of us." Max did not reply immediately. He maintained his gaze on the TV, although this time, there was an unmistakable shift in the atmosphere. It was not a complete dismissal. It was neither an invitation nor entirely exclusive. It constituted progress, although gradual. James glanced at Lisa, his eyes imploring her for assistance. Lisa acknowledged his intentions. She approached the couch, crouched, and delicately rested a hand on Max's shoulder. "Max," she stated gently, "I believe it would be beneficial for both of you. He is making an effort, you understand." Max shifted awkwardly. He murmured, his voice barely audible. James offered a slight, relieved smile. However, he refrained from pursuing it further. Instead, he seated himself at the adjacent table, wishing to avoid encroaching onto Max's space. For a brief period, an uncomfortable silence pervaded the room, interrupted solely by the sounds emanating from the game Max was engaged in. James was uncertain about his subsequent course of action. Ought he to exert greater effort? Ought he to permit Max to approach him? He was unaware. Max abruptly halted the game and directed his gaze towards James. He responded in a subdued tone. "However, I do not require your assistance." James smiled, a sensation of warmth enveloping his chest. Although it was modest, it was an initial step. "That is reasonable," he remarked. "Let us proceed outdoors and observe the outcome." They proceeded to the backyard, where James assisted Max in mounting his bicycle. He exercised caution by maintaining distance, allowing Max the opportunity to contemplate. However, Max's willingness to join him outside signified a significant advancement. As Max commenced riding, James maintained a vigilant watch, prepared to intervene if necessary, yet refraining from hovering. For the first time, James experienced a subdued sensation of achievement. This was not merely about instructing Max in cycling. It was about demonstrating his presence and his will to persist. He was making an effort. That was all he could accomplish at this moment. James perched on the porch steps, his elbows propped on his knees as he observed Max in the yard. The youngster sat on the grass, his hands clenched over his knees, gazing into the distance. The air had cooled marginally, the evening sun projecting elongated shadows across the yard. Yet James sensed a warmth in the moment. It was not flawless, quite the contrary, yet there was an essence present. Something authentic. Max had remained silent since their cycling session earlier that day. It had exceeded James's expectations. The initial attempts were awkward, with Max unsteadily trying to maintain balance. However, with time, he mastered the skill. He did not smile or express joy at successfully navigating the driveway without falling. However, James observed a subtle change. Max had begun to regard him differently, no longer as a stranger, but as a somebody he might trust, albeit to a limited extent. Although it was modest, it was an initial step. The distance between them had been gradually decreasing, yet substantial barriers remained, formidable and high. It appeared like Max was gradually permitting him access, albeit in little increments. James endeavored to maintain a buoyant dialogue, striving to avoid excessive pressure. Yet, an underlying tension persisted, suggesting that Max remained uncertain about his ability to trust him. James comprehended. How could he anticipate that the boy would simply disregard the years he had endured in solitude, absent of him? How could he anticipate Max to accept him when he had not supported him initially? Lisa emerged to accompany him, carrying 2 cups of tea. She passed one to James, her fingers momentarily grazing his, and took a seat beside him. Initially, neither of them spoke. They observed Max in quiet, each absorbed in their own reflections. The only sound between them was the wind rustling the leaves in the trees. Ultimately, Lisa articulated, her tone kind. "You are advancing, James. I perceive it." James faced her, his expression weary. He had not anticipated her to voice her thoughts, yet her words detonated within his vulnerable emotions. He stated, glancing at Max, "I am attempting, yet it seems insufficient. I remain an unfamiliar individual to him. He does not yet perceive me as his father." Lisa imbibed her tea prior to responding. "It requires time. It will not occur instantaneously. He has been without you for 4 years, James. He will find it challenging to accept you, even if he acknowledges your efforts." She hesitated, her expression becoming gentler. "However, you are present now and are resolute in your perseverance. That holds significant value for him, even if he does not exhibit it." James acquiesced, a constriction developing in his throat. He was uncertain of his expectations, perhaps anticipating that Max would abruptly embrace him and acknowledge him as the father he ought to have been. However, the reality was significantly more complex. Max's caution and reluctance were very justifiable. He had never requested this, nor desired his life to be upheaved. James had not been present for the boy, and now, after an extended period, he was expected to assume the role of a father. At times, it felt overwhelming, as though he had arrived too late. "What if I am insufficient?" James murmured softly, more to himself rather than to Lisa. "What if I am unable to accomplish this? What if he never perceives me as his father, regardless of my efforts?" Lisa placed her cup down and regarded him with a serious expression. "That is a concern shared by every parent, James. However, one cannot perceive it in that manner. You cannot dictate the pace or ease with which a child embraces you. What is significant is your presence and your effort. That exceeds the amount received by the majority of individuals." James did not respond promptly. He gazed at Max once more, who remained seated on the grass, seemed absorbed in his own reflections. He acknowledged that Lisa was correct, undoubtedly. He was unable to regulate the speed at which Max accepted him. However, the apprehension of disappointing him and the feeling of inadequacy persisted. It was difficult to dispel. "I am uncertain if I can accomplish this," James eventually articulated, his voice almost above a whisper. "I have dedicated my entire life to constructing something, exerting considerable effort, and now I have a dilemma I am uncertain how to resolve. I am uncertain about how to fulfill the paternal role he requires." Lisa's voice was gentle yet resolute. "Initially, none of us has the requisite knowledge to accomplish it. Perseverance is essential. Progress incrementally. I believe you are accomplishing more than you perceive." James gazed at her, his eyes brimming with a blend of appreciation and remorse. He had consistently embodied logic and confidence. His existence had been foreseeable and manageable. He had successfully orchestrated every aspect. However, fatherhood, being integral to Max's existence, was distinctly different. It was not accompanied by a handbook. There were no definitive solutions or established course of action. He was merely attempting to comprehend the situation. Max rose from the grass and approached them. He halted a few feet off, still avoiding direct eye contact, although his presence emanated a subtle invitation. Although he remained silent, his stance conveyed a sense of recognition that made James feel as though he was finally being acknowledged. "Greetings, Max," James spoke, his tone calm yet gentle. Max adjusted his posture and regarded James, his expression remaining cautious yet less defensive than previously. "May we engage in a game of catch?" he inquired, his voice diminutive yet imbued with a trace of hope that caused James's heart to flutter. James's mouth became parched, yet he acquiesced, the trepidation and uncertainty briefly dissipating as he rose. "Certainly," he remarked, his voice more resonant than he had intended. "Let us proceed." They engaged in tossing the ball to one another in the yard for the subsequent hour. Max was not the most proficient, but it was inconsequential. The significance was in their togetherness, engaging in a basic activity that felt ordinary. Although it was not the ideal father-son bonding experience James had anticipated, it was authentic, constituted an initiation. As the sun set and Max tossed the ball to him one final time before entering, James comprehended the essence of the moment. Not ideal moments or extravagant acts, but consistently appearing, day after day, and only being present. Max remained apprehensive and uncertain about James's identity. However, for the first time, James sensed he was progressing positively. Later that evening, as James sat in his vehicle prepared to depart, he gazed at the mansion one final time. A lengthy journey remained, although he had made a decision. He was not going to depart. He was determined to persist, regardless of the difficulty or uncertainty involved. He was no longer merely constructing an empire. He was establishing a family. That was invaluable. James awoke early the following morning, his mind still occupied with thoughts of Max. The prior day had yielded an unforeseen breakthrough, and he found himself revisiting each moment. James had never anticipated Max approaching him to request a game of catch. It was little and uncomplicated, yet it seemed to represent the initial stride toward genuinely bonding with his baby. It was not the significant moment he had envisioned, yet it was unnecessary for it to be. Max had extended an invitation to him, albeit briefly, which was sufficient to instill optimism in James. As he reclined in bed, gazing at the ceiling, he was unable to dispel the pervasive sense of uneasiness that burdened him. He was uncertain regarding the duration required for Max to fully trust him and to perceive him as more than merely the individual who had abruptly entered his life. James understood that he could not expedite the process. He needed to exercise patience, a quality in which he had never excelled. He had devoted his entire life to planning and striving towards a certain objective. However, with Max, there was no discernible trajectory or deadlines to adhere to. It entailed patience, consistently demonstrating his dedication each day. That afternoon, he resolved to adopt an alternative strategy. He would provide Max with space while simultaneously conveying his unwavering support. Following a tranquil morning at the office, James proceeded to Lisa's residence, cognizant of the necessity to advance despite the discomfort it entailed. It was no longer about huge gestures. Rather, it focused on the accumulation of little quotidian occurrences over time. Upon his arrival, Lisa welcomed him at the door with a modest yet inviting grin. She appeared somewhat more relaxed than previously, as if the tension that had earlier characterized their relationship had diminished. A degree of caution remained, albeit less intense than previously. She guided him into the living room, where Max was seated on the couch, perusing a comic book. "Greetings, Max," James remarked, attempting to appear nonchalant yet betraying a trace of anxiety in his tone. He was uncertain whether Max would reply. However, he had learnt to refrain from forming expectations. He would need to let Max to approach him at his own tempo. Initially, Max averted his gaze, and a hush lingered between them for some moments. James sensed the gravity of the situation and the burden of attempting to rectify something that had remained fractured for an extended period. However, he needed to remind himself that it was not imperative to resolve everything immediately. It involved constructing a relationship incrementally. Ultimately, Max raised his gaze, briefly locking contact with James before returning his attention to the comic book. He murmured, providing no other information. James detected that Max remained cautious and uncertain about how to engage with him. It resembled traversing on fragile eggshells, avoiding abrupt actions to prevent alarming him. "Would you like to engage in a game?" James inquired, attempting to appear nonchalant. "Perhaps we could venture outdoors once more. I could instruct you on the right technique for throwing a ball. I recall that at your age, I enjoyed playing catch." Max was silent for an extended while. James lingered, sensing the unspoken distance between them. He was uncertain whether he was doing the correct course of action, or if this was the appropriate method to contact Max. However, he understood that without attempting and exerting effort, no transformation would occur. Ultimately, Max dismissed the comic book and set it aside. He acquiesced, his voice subdued yet not wholly defiant. He rose and proceeded for the door, disregarding James, who trailed him outside, experiencing a modicum of relief. It was not a significant advancement, nevertheless it constituted progress. They engaged in ball tossing in the yard for the subsequent hour. Max exhibited a lack of enthusiasm. However, he did not withdraw. He tossed the ball lethargically, although his accuracy was enhancing. Gradually, he began to make eye contact with James during conversation, even presenting a subtle, hardly indiscernible smile upon successfully catching the ball without mishap. The advancement was gradual, yet it was indeed advancement. For the first time, James sensed that he was no longer an intruder attempting to impose himself into Max's life. He sensed that he was beginning to integrate into it, albeit in a little capacity for the time being. As the sun commenced its descent, Max tossed the ball one final time before returning within, prompting James to recognize something significant. This endeavor would not be facile, nor would it transpire instantaneously. However, he was determined to persist. He was resolute in his commitment to appear daily, regardless of the challenges encountered. Max was deserving of that, as was he. Later that evening, after departing from Lisa's residence and seated in his vehicle, James reflected on the day's events. He contemplated Max's interaction with him, noting how he had permitted his presence, although momentarily. For the first time, he sensed that perhaps he could accomplish this. Although he lacked all the answers and was uncertain about the future, he was beginning to believe in his capacity to be the father that Max required. He was not required to be flawless. He merely needed to persist. While driving home, James experienced a serene sense of tranquility. The journey was arduous, and he would encounter instances of self-doubt, questioning whether he was sufficient in his efforts. In that moment, with the recollection of Max's subtle smile vivid in his mind, James saw that it was not an act of capitulation. He did not depart. He intended to persist in his attendance, regardless of the difficulties encountered. Perhaps he would discover a method to make it feasible. James awoke the following morning with a revitalized sense of purpose, a sentiment he had not experienced in years. The moments he had shared with Max the prior day, regardless of their brevity, felt like a significant breakthrough. He devoted much of his life to constructing his empire and ascending his profession, while neglecting what genuinely mattered. However, with Max, the circumstances had changed. Uncertain of the future, he saw the necessity of exerting his utmost effort. For the first time, he was resolute in his ambition to transcend the role of a mere successful businessman. He was resolute in his desire to become a father. The morning was tranquil, with the sun scarcely illuminating the curtains of his room. He extended his limbs, and looked at his phone. A message was received from Lisa. It was brief yet significant. "Max inquired about you today. He appears to be becoming increasingly receptive. It appears he desires to meet with you." The statement instilled a surge of hope within him. It was insufficient yet adequate. Max desired to encounter him once more. That constituted an indication. It suggested that perhaps he was no longer the unfamiliar figure he had once appeared to his kid. James swiftly showered and donned his attire, his thoughts already concentrated on the forthcoming day. He had no intentions other than to spend time with Max, to persist in his efforts, and to consistently be present, regardless of the pace of improvement. He seized his keys, exited the door, and proceeded directly to Lisa's residence. Upon his arrival, Lisa greeted him with a grin as she opened the door, albeit with a hint of caution evident in her eyes. Previously, she had exhibited reticence and uncertainty in addressing the matter. However, today, she displayed a distinct change. She appeared less guarded than before, and for the first time, James observed the softening of her countenance. "Good morning," Lisa acknowledged him, moving aside to permit his entry. "Good morning," James responded, his tone composed yet tinged with enthusiasm. "What is the status of Max?" She remarked that he is well and has been inquiring about you. "I believe he is prepared for you to dedicate additional time to him today. You may enter and observe for yourself." James entered the living room, his heart racing. He was unaware of the reason for his anxiety. Although he was not obligated to demonstrate anything, each encounter with Max intensified his sense of paternal obligation and the need to atone for the years he had lost. Max was seated on the couch, manipulating a toy car. Upon observing James's entrance, he raised his gaze, a look of uncertainty manifesting on his countenance. "Greetings, Max," James uttered gently, advancing a few paces. He sought to avoid overwhelming the boy while also conveying his presence. Max did not answer promptly. He gazed at James for several moments before gradually placing the car beside him. He appeared uncertain, as if he were unsure of how to respond. James discerned that Max was still assimilating the information, yet there was a distinct change in his gaze this time. The fatigue persisted, albeit with diminished intensity. It appeared that Max was starting to acknowledge that James was not departing. "Would you like to engage in an activity today?" James inquired, attempting to appear nonchalant, but his heart racing more than he preferred. "Perhaps we could visit the park. Alternatively, one might engage in basketball practice in the driveway." Max paused, glancing between his toy car and James, as if deliberating his choices. James discerned the boy's lingering uncertainty around the prospect of extended interaction, yet it represented a little advancement that he was prepared to embrace. Following an extended delay, Max ultimately nodded, albeit imperceptibly. Max spoke softly. James remarked, endeavoring to maintain a cheerful tone, "Let us proceed." They proceeded outdoors and engaged in a game of basketball in the driveway for the subsequent few hours. Although it was not an ideal bonding experience, it was authentic. Initially, Max was hesitant and not quite involved, but gradually he started to relax. They alternated in shooting hoops, and with each attempt, the space between them diminished. James observed it in the manner Max's shoulders eased and in his laughter upon making a basket. He was not entirely at ease, yet he was beginning to derive pleasure from the experience. Eventually, they seated down on the curb, both panting. The sun was descending, creating an orange luminescence around the yard. James observed Max, who was reclining on his hands, gazing at the sky. The youngster initially remained silent, but thereafter he spoke in a subdued tone. "Thank you," Max remarked, his gaze fixed on the sky, "for dedicating time to my company. It is enjoyable." James had an overwhelming surge of emotion. The uncomplicated words and the kind manner in which Max spoke them conveyed significance beyond anything James could have envisioned. He was uncertain whether Max was prepared to wholly embrace him as his father, although this represented advancement. This indicated that they were progressing appropriately. "You're welcome," Max replied, his voice laden with emotion. "I am pleased that you are enjoying yourselves. I will always support you. You need never question that." Max remained silent. However, James noticed that he was attentive and beginning to comprehend. They did not require all the answers at this moment. It was unnecessary for them to resolve all issues in a single day. The significance lay in their collaborative endeavor, regardless of its modest nature, progressing incrementally each day. As James rose to depart, he glanced back at Max, who remained seated on the sidewalk, his gaze tracking him. "I will return tomorrow, understood?" James stated. Max nodded, exhibiting greater confidence than previously. Affirmative. James departed with a feeling of subdued pride. It was modest, yet it constituted a beginning. They commenced construction on a project, which sufficed for the present. For the first time, James realized that he could fulfill the paternal role Max required, becoming the man he had always aspired to become. The journey ahead was arduous. However, he was prepared to persist in his efforts. Designated for Max. For his own benefit. Regarding their future,